Hello, and welcome to Your Best Game Ever. This is a really exciting new series that we wanted to bring forth. So you are joining Monte Cook and myself, Darcy Ross, as we explore ways to get audio played back at you right at once. So we are hoping to teach you how to level up your games, if not your streaming setup. And we have always had an interest in helping people learn how to game, whether through intro videos of our games or new Game Master Month. But sometimes you want to dig a little deeper into a topic, and I think that's what this series is going to be. So we are really, really excited for all of you who have joined us. Please, retweet if you know some friends who might be interested in this, especially since this is going to be some concepts that are really relevant to any game you might play, or at least we hope so. So without further ado, Monte, do you want to tell us about the topic you're excited to share your hot takes on tonight?
Sure. So today we're mostly going to be focused on GM related ideas, right? But I think this series, has a lot of potential to do things with players and how to handle various things as a group, and we can go a lot of different places. But we decided to start today talking about GM issues, and specifically we wanted to talk about dice, right? And that's why we decided to call this "Don't Randomize Fun," right?
Absolutely.
And really, it's kind of the pitfalls of relying on dice, I say that and everyone kind of bristles, right? Because dice are fun, right? We all love dice.
Monty wants to take away your dice.
It's a fun part of the game. I mean, like everyone else, I have a million dice. I love dice. I have my favorite dice. We love to see where the dice take us, right? Are the players going to defeat their foe and be victorious? Or are they going to not be able to defeat their foe and they have to run? It changes the way things work, changes the way things go in the story. And that's cool, right? That's interesting. But I think as GMs, we need to recognize that there are some potential pitfalls in relying too heavily on dice and not maybe heavily enough on, our own understanding of story and drama and narrative and just fun, right? Even if you don't want to get all pretentious and talk about narrative or whatever, right? I mean, we're here to have fun.
Yeah.
So let me give a very specific example of something that happens all the time in games, right? The player characters go into a new area and there's an NPC there and they're talking to him, but the important part about the scene is that behind him there's a little secret cache that with maybe something sticking out of it or something, and the whole idea is the player characters pick up on that, right? And then they have to figure out how to get past this guy so that they can get inside that secret thing.
This is the plan before the GM the GM's beautiful notes meets the players, correct?
right And so this is what's going to happen, and then the adventure starts, right? Because cool things happen when they find the secret thing. Well, so what do you do as a GM? Well, most of us would just say, okay, everyone make a perception roll while you're talking to this guy, or whatever, right? Or whatever game you're playing, right? Whatever you call that, a spot check, whatever, right? Doesn't matter. The problem, of course, is what happens if everyone fails, right? Because then you've just set up your whole adventure, your whole story, whatever, just comes to a dead stop because you've set it up so that they have to succeed at that thing and they fail. And so what do you do, right? Well, you fudge, right? Everyone, the highest roll was a 3 and you're like, oh, well, it turns out you only need the 3 to succeed, right? Or you say, okay, well, everyone failed. And so you have the encounter going a little bit longer and you're like, everyone make a perception check again, right? And you're just kind of waiting for somebody to succeed, right? Or you completely rework the whole thing, right? And you're like, well, someone comes in and tells you about the secret thing, right? That secret cache or something. but regardless, or probably worst case scenario, I guess I should mention this too. You just say, okay, well, I guess
that doesn't happen now.
It doesn't happen, right? And so all that fun stuff that we had planned now just doesn't get to happen. And that can be really problematic. And that's exactly what I mean when I say don't randomize fun, right? Because the fun is on the other side of that perception check. And if you fail it, then and so the sort of controversial thing that I'm going to say there is don't make the roll, right? Just tell somebody, pick out a player, pick out the most perceptive player, the guy who put a lot of points in perception or whatever your mechanic is, right? And say, because you are so skilled, right? Or because you're so observant, your elvish eyes are so keen, whatever, right?
Right.
You say you see this secret, you see this weird thing sticking out of the wall that suggests that there's a secret cache there. And you just go, right? And the adventure keeps going, and you've rewarded that person for being, I wanted to make a perceptive character.
Right.
And that pays off, right?
Yeah.
But you don't have to worry about the dice getting in the way. And I think even as a general rule, right, there's advice out there for game masters, right? That is something along the lines of, when in doubt, have the players make a roll, right? Right. We always see GMs when they're put sort of on the spot, right? A player says they want to do a certain thing, or they ask a question. You're like,
I'm so guilty of this. I'm like, I need time.
Right. Yeah. Because it's really kind of a stalling tactic more than anything, right? And so what I'm going to say, though, is that that's not necessarily the best instinct. And that's not always the best advice. In fact, sometimes I'm going to say it's bad advice because, well, if you're using it as a stalling tactic, you want it to slow things down. But the truth is, right, having somebody roll dice slows the game down. And I know that doesn't sound like, because a single die roll doesn't take very much time at the table. But, way back when we were working on 3rd edition D&D, right, we actually did some work on this and figured out, right, if we eliminated a certain number of rolls or checks in a given game session, like, because we figured out how long it takes to roll a die and add a number to it and tell the GM, and the GM says that's a success or failure, and here's what happens, right? Like, it turns out it's a huge amount of time. If you can knock even 10% of the dice rolls out of the game, you get like 20 extra minutes to play the game, right?
It's wild. That's a really cool study functionally.
Yeah. I mean, I don't remember the exact numbers anymore. I just remember that it is dramatic, right? That if what we were looking at the time was, things where a certain action might require 2 rolls as opposed to 1, right? And just by getting rid of that, it sped the game up. Yeah. And then plus it's just sort of sometimes there can be math fatigue, I think, in a game, right? Especially if you play a long session. I'm sure you've seen this, right?
Yeah.
Where people are just like, I'm so tired of looking at numbers. And I mean, even though it's just like simple arithmetic, everyone's like, okay,
I don't care if this is my charge ability versus my other ability. I really don't.
Right. Exactly. You're just like, whatever.
Yeah.
Right? And so, the less you can do that, the more you'll stay away from that kind of fatigue, right? And you'll make it like, if every time you sit down and roll the dice at the table, that it's important, that the outcome is important, then it's always going to be an important thing. It's always exactly right. Yeah. I mean, I think that one of the key moments, certainly as a game designer, I've often thought that to design, you design toward moments, right? And one of those moments that you design toward is the moment when one player picks up the die and everyone gets quiet because the outcome of that die roll is so important, right? And so that moment, I think, is an important one, and the only way to really achieve that is if you aren't already just making 1,000 rolls all the time, right?
I guess that's an interesting point. I know when we talked about this earlier too, though, like all of our advice and discussion today is kind of couched in the experience you're looking for. So just as you as a game designer are designing toward moments, I think you and I talked about how you treat the dice and how you treat randomness should also be geared toward the kind of moments you want to have at your table. So
right.
I guess that might be a good time for me to ask you, especially with this idea of when do you call for a roll, how do you set those dials of randomness in your game? What do you like? Where do you think the people really need to worry more about perception rolls or about randomness and rolling? So we talked about how perception could be really dangerous as a time when the dice might come into play. Really think about what that is doing to your game and what that is it working for you or against you potentially, right? Is it just a selling tactic? Are there other moments you kind of like to watch out for, or certain game experiences where you think it's particularly important?
Yeah, well, pretty much any time, the game master is the conduit through which all information flows, right? The players can't know anything about the game world unless that comes from the game master. And so anytime that, if you think of the GM's mouth as a faucet, right? And anytime you're going to turn that faucet off because of a bad die roll, right? You're probably hurting the game. And so, I use perception as an example, but how many times have you seen in a game where like a player asks a question like, well, did these aliens ever come to Earth before or whatever? And the game master says, well, make me a intellect based roll, right? Or whatever, right?
Knowledge, recollection.
Yeah. And what you really want, I mean, when it's information like that, when it's cool details, you
want to give them.
Exactly, right? You want to give, I mean, here you've got someone actually asking you for the lore that you have made up for your campaign.
Engaged.
Yeah, exactly. So you want to reward that. So
great point.
Again, right? Just don't skip the roll and don't make them, randomize whether they get that cool info. Just give it to them, right? Cool. It seems like to some people that advice seems like you're just handing the players the keys to the kingdom, I think. But particularly in that example, they just asked the question, and maybe it's the just the fact that they asked the right question, right?
Yeah.
Like I think that's much more important than what number came up randomly on a die.
Absolutely. Do you think that so one thing I think I would miss as a GM when I do call for those rolls is the tension that calling for the roll can lead to. It doesn't always, it isn't an automatic tension bar, especially if you have too many rolls going on, but it can be, right? Or calling for a roll when they're in a place that they didn't think anything secret might be afoot, and now they're like, oh, is there something secret afoot? Calling for the roll can give you that beat of breath intake, and is there something here, and can I find it? It's a little metagamey for sure, because it's all player knowledge, not character knowledge yet. So are there other ways that moment can be elicited without rolls? I have one. So especially here's a Band-Aid solution I found when I have made the mistake of hiding something important behind a roll and then failing that roll, is GM intrusions or just hiding something behind a roll that no one initiates, right? Or they just want to go through the room, and I'm like, it's actually important that you find something in this room. GM intrusions have been my, you hold up 2 XP, right? And you get that moment of something new and interesting is afoot. And with GM intrusions, it's automatic that the thing is going to engage with them in some way or another,
Right.
but they
Right.
still have the kind of choice to accept or refuse it. And so it's not immediately like, I am delivering this exciting new information to you. That gets me some of that beat of mystery without the like pitfall of, oh, it wasn't that interesting, or I can't know that now, right? So that's been one of my Band-Aid solutions, but I'm curious if there are other.
I wouldn't even call that a Band-Aid solution. I think that that's why in the Cypher system, where we designed it specifically so that it's more narrative, right?
Right.
The game master doesn't roll dice at all, right? Because that's what you'd do in another game, right? You'd see the DM roll some dice behind a screen or something, and say, "Oh, well,
Right.
this thing happens," right? And the GM intrusion is a way to replace the GM rolling dice, right? The example that I give in the Numenera book is, the bad guys are pounding on the door, and the GM needs to know, well, when do they break through, right? When do they get through the door to get at the PCs? And rather than just sitting there and rolling dice to determine that, you choose, right? And you make it a GM intrusion. So I think that's a great example. I'm glad you brought that up.
Oh, well, that's validating. Yay. GM intrusions are just my favorite for that. I guess another question I have is about tone, I think, in terms of like, and I think some people who, especially those of you in chat who, especially if you're worried we're going to take away your dice, fear not. Especially the kind of game you're wanting to run, certain like numbers of die rolls, certain ways that you treat chance and probability really matter, and even where you place the randomness too, right? Like I know, and I think for me it comes down a lot to tone. I'm sure the different kind of game experience varies, but I think the tone is the thing that can really like get broken or turn in a way that makes the game less fun if you mismatch kind of the mechanics to the tone you're trying to seek. When that breaks, it can be even more important than, am I running a dungeon crawl or am I running a court of intrigue thing? Because the tone, right. If people are mismatched on tone, it becomes a much bigger bummer for me. So yeah, do you have some advice or thoughts on?
I do have thoughts on that. Yeah, so if you're playing just some kind of Wahoo, Hong Kong action kind of thing, or even sort of standard Dungeons and Dragons level fantasy, sort of as the book is written, I would say that's Wahoo enough that, sure, whatever, roll the dice, see what the dice say, right? In pretty much any situation, but be very aware of what's going to happen. Like I remember playing in a game. This was a long time ago, and I think that what the circumstances were like a carrier pigeon was flying away, and it had a message, and the player characters didn't want the message to be delivered. I was a player at the time, and so one of the other players said, okay, well, I'm going to take out my bow and I'm going to shoot this bird. But the GM had already established that the bird was really far away. And so the GM did what most GMs do, right? And said, give me a roll, right? And we all knew that it really should be impossible at this point to hit that bird, right? Because of the circumstances of the game, and there was other stuff going on, there's no way. But of course, what happens, right? The player and the game master just thinks, okay, the guy's going to roll middling, and then that'll be a miss, but at least he'll have gotten the opportunity. But of course, he rolled a 20, right? And so the GM
do. When it will break your tone, they do.
Right. And so he was the GM at the time was obligated to say, well, you shoot the arrow, twice as far as anyone's ever fired an arrow before, and you hit this tiny bird, even though it's already disappeared over the top of the trees, right?
Yep.
And the problem there was that I know that as I was sitting there as a player at the table, I was like, well, what kind of game are we playing here, right? I mean, it just kind of felt like all bets are off now. I don't really understand how reality works here because that was impossible. And I just saw it happen, and it wasn't like it was a magic spell or whatever. Right.
Right.
And so it really hurt the tone, like that you brought up. And so I think that there are times, particularly when you don't want a super wahoo crazy game, there are times when the GM should just say no, right? And say, it's too far away. I'm sorry, right? Or whatever the circumstance is, rather than giving somebody the opportunity to do something that you don't want to do. So I was involved in debate when I was much younger, right? High school and college and whatnot. And there's a part of debate where you are asking your opposing debater questions, right? It's called cross-examination. And one of the things that they teach you about cross-examination is, and I'm sure this is probably true for lawyers too, when lawyers cross-examine, don't ever ask a question that you don't already know the answer to, right? And I think that game masters can kind of take that and say, don't ever ask for a die roll unless you are prepared for both potential outcomes, right? Unless both those potential outcomes, success or failure, unless they can both work, you don't let that die roll happen, because that 20 is going to come up, right? Or that 1, right? How many times, like, like the big burly guy goes to break down the door and, he rolled a 1. And then it's like, oh, well, okay, that's weird.
And it should be a good character moment. That's always such a bummer. You try to, as a GM, you try to give them that space to shine, but you still let them roll. One interesting thing that I thought was said in chat was Dash of Daka said, for some roles, if the conclusion as a GM is sort of a done deal, they can still let the player, if you feel like rolling somehow would enhance the moment, you can roll for kind of the level of coolness of it. And so that's one thing I've done with like the Numenera scan ability. Scan automatically tells you the level, it tells you, potentially something else the GM wants you to give. But sometimes especially depending on how we've ruled their scan ability works in what the logic for that character is behind that ability, I'll let them roll. And if they get a 20, you get that, epic, also something really important, right? If you get the 1, you still get the level, so it's not a total loss. And maybe you get some, maybe something starts to go a little wrong with it or something, right? You get a GM intrusion. So I really like that piece of advice. That's a neat one. It doesn't work for every situation, but. No,
but that is fun, right? But I would say even then, right, be upfront and say, okay, well, you're going to succeed and find out some information, but let's see if you can find out even more information, right? And roll the die.
Absolutely. If you are interested in talking about it, I wanted to talk a little bit about randomness almost on the GM's side, right? We've talked a lot about randomness in how the players are engaging with the fiction that the GM is fauceting down at them. But I made this beautiful children's level map with colored pencils and highlighter on Tuesday because I was using the Jade Colossus ruin building engine to build a place that you yourself as a player will go someday.
I shouldn't look at that then.
You definitely, well, good luck. Good luck interpreting that. But I used this mapping engine to help me sketch out a ruin. And so, but I think there's a number of ways that GMs use randomness on their end. And do you have any advice for them or thoughts about how beholden you should feel to some of those, to the results you get as a GM from random tables, and are there places in your GMing that you think it's almost always safe to use some random generation versus as a GM, watch out for these? Yeah, just what's your perspective on GMs and randomness?
Well, so that's an interesting example of so in Numenera, we've taken dice out of the GM's hands at the table, right? But in preparing an adventure, whether it be like something like you did, or even just like, oh, let's roll up some ciphers that the player characters find, or whatever, right? All of those are attached to random die rolls and tables, and in fact, kind of in the cipher system, there's a little bit of dice code going on. And what I mean by that is, in the cipher system, we use 20-sided dice, 6-sided dice, and percentile dice. Basically, only the GM ever uses the percentile dice. And it's almost always behind the scenes or between sessions or whatever. So you know that if there's a table and it's tied to a percentile dice roll, that's kind of code for, this is a table just for the GM. This is
super neat.
So
I never noticed that, but you're totally right.
Yeah, and so I think that's great. And I think that how closely you want to adhere to that is totally up to you. I just think that you should make the choice ahead of time. I think because I think it's fun, right? I think it's fun to say, okay, this time I'm going to go through and I'm going to make this thing. I'm going to roll up these ciphers. I'm going to do this, and I'm just going to go by what the dice roll and let the dice, fall as they may, and that's fun, right? Because you might end up, oh my gosh, they're going to, discover this level 10 detonation cipher. It's going to be able to, blow up half a city. What are they going to do with that? Right. That'll be interesting, right? Or before you sit down to make those rolls, you say to yourself, okay, well, I'm guiding the narrative. I'm just going to roll the dice, just so that I'm not like, one of the things that can happen is if you just choose, you can accidentally fall into a rut and always end up choosing the same thing.
Exactly.
Right. And, in Numenera, right, it's like, oh, I'm just always choosing fire detonations.
I'm like, everything's right? Bugs again, Darcy. Everything needs to maybe not be bugs all the time.
Exactly. But you should, and so the dice can help you there, but you can still, use your sense of, well, I don't really want that in my game, right, or I don't want that to happen right now, or whatever, right? Because like if you're playing a Numenera and Cipher system, we do have random encounter systems and whatever, but I don't feel like most people probably use them in the same way that like old school D&D, right? You're like, roll on this encounter table and, oh no, it's fire giants. We're hosed, right?
Yeah.
If you're upfront about, like, I've run that game, right? Not very long ago. I ran like an old school D&D, not even first edition, the little booklet D&D, and I didn't have a screen. I rolled the dice in front of everybody, like they could see the same table I was looking at, right?
That's cool.
And if it came up fire giants or then they all just knew that they were hosed, and lots of characters died, but that was part of the fun.
Right.
I think when you and I were talking recently, you brought up the DCC game, right? Which is all based on random dice rolls, and that's part of that game's fun, and that's cool. But I think you need to be aware that, that if you're running like this big epic story-driven narrative game, and suddenly you just introduce something random like that, fellow MCGer Bruce Cordell once ran a Gamma World game way back in the day, like original Gamma World, and I was a player, and we spent like 2 or 3 hours making these complicated characters with mutations and everything. We start out on the adventure. The very first thing happens. He rolls a random encounter. It's these like radiation moth things, and they just come and we all die.
Yep.
And
I have so many stories like that. Jeez. That's I think talking to your players a lot and about what kind of game this is going to be, and because of an experience that we my home gaming group now calls Fantasy Vietnam. It was all scarring, and there was a lot of it didn't feel very filled with we didn't really know why we were there. We were just in this horrible place where story was tantalizingly dripped in front of us, but then was taken away as we all died every session.
Oh, yeah.
So now I think one thing I do as a GM is I my session 0, or even, sometimes I'll do this at con games, although for a single session, kind of, if somebody dies at the end, that's kind of a fun thing, right? Because we're never going to play again. But for campaigns, how are we dealing with death? Do you guys, do you want to play a game where death is a very real possibility bearing down upon you? Or do you want to play a game where, especially in Numenera, death is, there's ciphers, there's old world tech, death can be almost an invisible sun too, a character arc, right? It can be a thing that you've passed through and your players go resurrect you by some horrible machine. So knowing how to treat that and whether you want to be sticking with your characters that long is something that I really like to try to get on the same page with my players. So that's been my attempt at a solution for that anyway.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, in particular in Invisible Sun, death is baked right in. I mean, it is actually a very unforgiving and deadly system. Yep. It isn't the kind of game where you're throwing down and fighting a lot, but when you do fight, people get really hurt really fast, and that's intentional because dying in Invisible Sun is actually part of the fun. Right, because then you get to be a ghost and you do cool ghost things for a while and you get to come back, right?
Speaking of shameless plug, this Friday is going to be The Raven Wants What You Have, and there is our friend Saru is going to go in a fight ring for us, and so he's going to fight for us, and it was a very intense battle where I deeply worried for poor Sean. So definitely tune in at 7 p.m. Pacific at this channel tomorrow to see how that goes, because it's really fun to see how combat works in Invisible Sun. So get excited.
Cool. Yeah, and we'll be there in chat talking about it. So
yeah. Kind of speaking of Invisible Sun too, I wanted to, you talked about games you've played in the past and different game experiences that you've both played and designed, and so you have all this experience. And Invisible Sun is a really, really wild game with lots of cool design that I'm still discovering as I run it and as I read more. So it's got a number of modules, I think, where randomness can play, right? There are roles, right? There's your average everyday roles where you're trying to accomplish a thing that has some kind of chance of failure. There's also the Sooth deck. And so, and I'm sure there's many other places that you've thought about. There's, on the GM side, lots of tables. With that long-winded entrance, I guess I just wanted to know how your ideas about randomness and design and this whole, everything we've talked about today, how have you tied and stitched together design in your recent games to work around that, accommodate it, engage with it, or stay away from it? Just what kind of interesting bits of design do you think about with Invisible Sun that have to do with randomness?
Well, actually, let me back up even one more step, right, and say that look kind of almost as a stepping stone kind of thing, because you move to the cipher system, so you've got most conventional other games, Dungeons and Dragons, Pathfinder, all these great games.
Yeah.
And then you move to the cipher system, and one of the intentions behind the design of the cipher system is to increase player agency. And what I mean by that, because that term gets thrown around a lot, is players have the ability to decrease randomness on their own in the cipher system, right? You can use effort, making the task easier, or maybe even making it so you don't have to make a roll at all, right? If you lower the difficulty to 0, that's why that exists, is so that players have more control. So you can decide, this is a really important task to me, so I really want to succeed at it.
Yeah.
I would say in some ways, Invisible Sun is another step sort of beyond that. It has a similar kind of mechanic it's not called effort, but there's a similar sort of player control mechanic built into the game so that you can try harder. There are in fact multiple things like that, because you can also enhance it with magic in a mechanic called sortilege, right? Where you're not just trying hard, you're putting magic into it, right?
But at a risk.
Right.
I love.
Right. Because the more magic you use, the more chance you can get of magical flux, which screws everything up, right? Which is fun. And again, a use of randomness, right?
Yeah.
Because magical flux only happens in the game if you roll a 0 on the magic die, right? Mm-hmm. Or multiple magic dice. And so that is, it's embracing randomness at the table. At the same time, though, Invisible Sun eliminates randomness away from the table in that, there are lists of things of cool NPCs or weird creatures or interesting effects or all these different things, but none of them is built as a random table. They're all built as lists, encouraging the game master to choose rather than allow the dice to dictate anything, right? Because the narrative and the story is even more king than it is in the Cypher system. But then at the same time, Invisible Sun introduces a whole new level of randomness in the Sooth deck, where you're literally, throughout the course of the game, playing down a random card, which changes the way magic works, which it does a lot, really, right? It changes the way magic works, which keeps magic feeling kind of wondrous, but also not entirely controllable, right? Which I think is what you want with magic. You don't want to feel like it's a science that you can totally control.
Right.
But at the same time, the Sooth deck also randomizes ideas for the game master, right? That the game master at any time can look at the Sooth deck that she just played, and that can inspire something that happens next in the game, right? That nobody saw coming, including the game master, even though the game, if it's coming out of her imagination, it is something that she might not have thought of until she pulled out the Lost Star card, right? And saw the cat playing with the little thing and realizes,
that must be.
Right. Oh, I'm going to introduce a rare and random treasure, and I wouldn't have thought of doing that except for I drew the card. So, I mean, it kind of is capturing that tarot deck kind of feeling of card turns having meaning, both in terms of mechanics, but also in terms of story.
But even that has, so much choice baked into it too, right? These Sooth deck cards. And if you search on Twitter, #SoothDeck, SOOTH deck, we have posted I think all of the Sooth deck cards, and they're very, very short meaning. And so they've each got a couple concepts that they embody, but that card itself also has a number, and it has a heart, which is associated with certain characters. And so it can even give you a sense of who that cool piece of treasure, maybe whose eye it catches. And and there's the suns, the different magical conduits that they resonate with. And sometimes they're of the, just like a tarot deck, sometimes there are special versions of a card within a heart, and so within a family. And so there are some that are like give +1 venture to people. So, but even, so that's just, you look at the card, but the art is really complex and beautiful too. And sometimes I'll notice, maybe I'll key off of a different aspect that is in that art than I did in the past. And then fortunately, like every once in a while, when I've been running A Woman with Hollow Eyes on the One Shot Network, especially when I was starting out, I would look at the very short description and I was like, how do I work this in, especially in development mode, where that is the randomizer, right? That is the, how does this work? We step away from the character sheets and the dice, and we're in a coffee shop or whatever. And so, but there's like a full page spread for each card, thinking about different ways to help you conceptualize what this might do in your game, sort of in a like like ways it could be good, ways it could be bad. And so within all that nuance, I'm always able to find something really cool and juicy to tie in. But now that I've been jamming for a while, I'm very surprised because I've only jammed maybe 11 sessions of it, maybe a little more. And like, I am referencing that document less and less. It almost feels like I'm getting my own headcanon of I've drawn this card before, and I'm almost building on things that card has referenced before in the same campaign, right? It's almost
nice.
You're getting this extra layer of connections, I guess, and that's been super fun to see. So I love that. I love that that's built into the core experience of a game, because as that's just my game mastering style, is I like to have something to bounce off of. And so what I've done in the past a lot of times is to have tables or co-GMs, right? Because I have another human to faucet things at me that I go pick the gems that I'm excited by. But having the Sooth deck there is just does wonders for my game mastering style in terms of when I feel the need to have something to bounce off of, but still make a choice about. That is just my style. So that's when I'm 1,100% on board the Sooth deck train.
I've had a lot of people say, I don't know if I'm going to be able to come up with the surreal nature of the game, or, if I'm going to be able to, the game actually requires the game master to do a fair bit of improvisation or on the fly kind of creation, but I've had people say, I don't think I can do that. But I always then explain to them the Sooth deck. The Sooth deck is kind of your co-GM, right?
Yeah,
the Sooth deck is the thing that's going to help you. If you're, when in doubt, don't roll the dice, right? Yeah. Look at the Sooth deck and draw a card. Right. Because the great thing about that is that, unlike when in doubt, roll the dice, who knows what's going to happen, and it might end up, completely changing things. But when in doubt, draw a Sooth card means you're always going to get an answer. It's just how you want to interpret it. Right.
Yeah. And I guess that's reminds me of one more point about Invisible Sun. It just seeps this rich tone with all the art. And I think I know some people who I was friends with when I was trying to get my Invisible Sun group together. When I heard it was coming together, I was like, okay, who can I drag into this? They were like, oh, this surreal fantasy setting. I'm not sure if I'll be able to kind of nail that tone. But between all the art and the GM advice and your own character abilities and those not random tables, right? Like all of those and the Sooth deck, right? All of those are dialed into that tone and atmosphere for you, it feels like, right? It feels like it doesn't actually, I don't feel like I'm spending time as a GM working to achieve that tone, because it flows very well from the tables and the Sooth deck. It makes it much easier to achieve that tone than it would otherwise, I think. It kind of anchors you, especially as a big physical object, right? Like I don't know, something about the visual nature of Invisible Sun really helps keep everybody dialed into that same tone. I think that's one of its huge strengths.
Putting it that way, which I really like, it makes me realize that it's another interesting difference between Cypher System and Invisible Sun in how it uses randomness. Because, in Numenera, right, we need to somehow portray the just weird, unknowable sort of aspects of the prior worlds and the stuff that you find. It's just really weird. And it sort of makes sense to inject randomness into that and just say, yeah, this does this crazy thing. And almost to the point where, like, even the game master doesn't know why this thing is suddenly, making gravity altered 90 degrees or whatever, right? But in Invisible Sun, we don't have that, because even though you've still got this surreal nature, even though it's still weird, so to speak, it's a more, even though it's surreal, it's a more understandable. There's a theme and a tone, which is a word we keep using, but there's an idea. Oh, I see, this makes sense, even though it totally doesn't, right? At least in sort of a gut level. Oh, okay, so she's got spiders for eyes that fits this whole thing, right? It's not just some random thing. Oh, she's got spiders for eyes.
Yeah. Numenera, you're almost trying to, I think you've said this to me before, and I definitely think it's true. It's the human brain wants to see those connections. So a lot of times when you're pulling the Sooth deck cards, they come up eerily on point, terrifyingly on point. Okay, this is going to happen to anyone who plays with these. But it's I'm sure it's part of it is they are so dialed into that specific tone and atmosphere that they're already resonating with themselves, but also the human brain just wants to pattern match so bad. It's so your brain is just constantly low level looking for those connections. And so Numenera is almost you're taking that and you're actively trying to break it. So, but I feel like with Invisible Sun, you're letting that natural process happen.
That's a great way to put it. Yes.
Oh, so good.
Yeah. In fact, now since you say that, right, there is, so without going too far down this rabbit hole, right, there is an important element of synchronicity that distinguishes surrealism from just weird, right?
Yeah.
And that synchronicity being those things that we connect even sometimes unconsciously. And that is a big factor in Invisible Sun and the way Invisible Sun is designed. And the way of a lot of the GM advice is given is to encourage that level of almost subconscious level synchronicity.
Yeah. Oh, super interesting. I'll have to think about that more as I watch my own GMing.
Well, but it comes naturally, right? Like you were just saying, right? You pull those Sooth card. Like I had to write in the rules of Invisible Sun, the Sooth deck is not an actual divinatory tool. I have not created some, right? Even though, but it makes you understand why people believe in divinatory tools and whatnot, because your brain starts to draw those connections, and it's like, oh well, of course you wrote, of course you drew that card now, right? The hunter, of course, because we're being hunted. It says that, I've had people actually accuse me in playing Invisible Sun that I had stacked the deck because it fit the events so well, right?
Which is not trivial to do with the strange round cards.
right
To surreptitiously stack the deck.
I'm lucky to not just drop them all over the floor when I pick up the deck. So
it's an acquired skill.
It is.
Oh, excellent. One thing this is sort of tacked on, and I don't want this to become too Invisible Sun. It's just very on my mind because I'm jamming it right now. But I guess maybe if we zoom out a little bit, we've talked a lot about like GM prep and then in the moment randomness. Sort of a player, there is a secret behind a door that a player can roll for. But I guess, especially as GMs maybe think about campaign play, how do you think about randomness in branching patterns of choices players might make, especially if you're gearing up toward, I don't know, how do you think about like session to session randomness? How do you, part of why I'm asking this is because I know that you are fussing with the directed campaign, which is Invisible Sun's unique answer to how do we, if you want, I guess maybe I should let you explain it before I mangle it.
No, I think you are right on the right track, right? Okay. It can be a challenging game to run. So wouldn't it be nice if there was a guide that was kind of telling me session by session what I should do next? Well, that's what the directed campaign is. Mm-hmm. It's constantly evolving. It's constantly moving forward. You're getting new updates every month. Introduce this into your session this particular time, right? I mean, it's much, much more so than just playing a prepackaged adventure. It is really, it's like having a co-GM kind of feeding you all the stuff you need.
But I bet, especially for Invisible Sun, you'll have to build in maybe even more randomness than you might have had to in some other games, because there's an expectation that character arcs, are going to be really getting their claws into it. So are you presenting it more as like opportunities and things that are going, how can you talk about how?
you're right in that in Invisible Sun, it's the character arcs that kind of drive the flow. And so what that means is that I'm kind of showing, as things go along, I show the game master how to tailor. Okay, so you've got a player character who's got this solve a mystery arc, and they're trying to solve the mystery of what happened to this long lost magical book. Or you've got someone in a completely different game, right? Someone's got to solve a mystery of where did this magical spell knowledge go, or whatever, right? Yeah. I'm having trouble coming up with it, but the two completely different arcs in two completely different campaigns. Yeah. Well, so what I do is I instruct them on how to take whatever the culmination of that arc is, whatever they're seeking is great, and that's individualized, but the barriers that you put up, the obstacles the challenges they have to overcome, I can feed you those, right? And I can say, well, what you should do is have it be this, and this would be really cool, and use this NPC and that kind of thing. So it's really, it's kind of a combination of pre-made stuff, but also lots and lots of GM advice and telling you how to tailor this to your campaign, or we don't really use the word campaign, we use narrative, but whatever, and how to make that work for you, right?
I've run a lot of zany games where the tone gets really wild and the players just yank that my plans all around. And so I think by nature that has become a lot of how I prep, is expecting things to get pulled in strange directions. So all you have are these floating modules of stuff I've prepped that are going to get in the way or be interesting, and I'm going to slot them in wherever the players find their noses next.
We should totally do one of these episodes on prep and how best to prep and pitfalls in prepping.
Yeah. I think this is a great place to end it. I think we've covered a lot of ground, if that sounds good to you.
Sure.
And chat, if you have some ideas about topics you'd like to see, maybe tweet at us with the hashtag #YourBestGameEver. And so these can be topics that are GM focused or player focused. I think we're interested in just many different kinds of techniques and advice and conversations we can have to all take this hobby that we love and make it even better for us all and for the people we play it with. So we hope you like this. Any final words or emphatic hot takes?
Well, just kind of, I would say, be aware of the effect that dice can have on your game, and the effect that randomness can have. I'm certainly not saying don't roll the dice. I'm not saying roll the dice all the time. I'm saying just know what you're getting into when you say, give me a roll, what the implications are going to be.
Excellent. And talk to your players about it too. So that nobody's misled. I think that's really good. Cool. Well, we hope this advice helps and inspires you and gets you excited to run your next game. And let us know if you implemented any of these ideas, or if you have some stories to share. Definitely tweet at us or post on Facebook. You can post in chat, but chat goes away after a while, sadly, on Twitch. So we love it if you put it somewhere where we can archive it longer. All these videos go up on YouTube. So if you have friends who haven't seen this, you weren't able to make the live show, that will go up in about a week. And there are a couple other Twitch events I want to tell you about really quick, where you can maybe see this in action. Maybe sometimes you see me misstepping in action. That occasionally happens. I'll never tell, though. I'll definitely tell. So tomorrow, I said, The Raven Wants What You Have is our pre-recorded narrative of Invisible Sun with Monte GMing and Shauna Germain, Bruce Cordell, Sean Reynolds, and myself as players. And but lots of us are in chat actively watching and chatting along with you. So it's super fun if you want some kind of close interaction with the creative team of MCG. It's always a really, really good time. And so that will be happening at 7 p.m. Pacific time tomorrow, Friday. And it's going to be a really wild one, not only because of the narrative that's coming up, what's actually happening, which I said involves some combat, and we already said it, combat in Invisible Sun can be pretty intense. So definitely come see that. But there's another special thing we are going to be doing for people who are watching live that day. So if you can possibly make it, or if you have a friend who might be interested in Invisible Sun, maybe want to try it out, this is the episode to make, I would say. So come on over. A week after that, we will be having our The Raven Wants What You Have live session. So this is where some members of the players and the GM get together to talk about the show, to take some questions from the audience. So a lot of us, we cosplayed and or character choices we made, or sort of behind the scenes, what was that weird ability you did, or asking us player questions or GM questions are sort of all open, and we talk about what the experience was like. So that's another great way to get a sense of how Invisible Sun might work for you, and also just to get inside the heads of people who you may just have read their books. So we hope this is a way to be accessible to you. So that's the next two The Raven Wants What You Have episodes on Fridays at 7 p.m. Pacific. And on Sunday, we will have The Owl of Lycia episode 2. That's at 2 p.m. Pacific. And that's a really cool custom setting cipher system campaign run by Marcy Vellin. And it's really wild. And it's just we're really excited to be able to show off campaigns that aren't run by us, right? And games that are members of the community showing off what their particular take on our games are and how they craft a cipher system campaign. So it was super fun. It's a good group of people. And Marcy is an incredible artist and has sketched all these PCs and NPCs and has all this like beautiful, rich world building that's been super fun to get a taste of. So definitely show up that Sunday at 2 p.m. Pacific. On Tuesday, maybe you'll get to see what this strange map does if the players get there. But in any case, it's our Echoes Linger Numenera campaign with Monte as a player, and along with Bruce and Sean and Shauna. And I'm GMing, and that's been super fun to see how Monte is actually behaves in the player seat, which is lovely. So
wonderfully, I think, is the answer.
Behave, Monte. So please, if you haven't already, we would love it if you followed us on Twitch and followed us on YouTube, as we release new kinds of content all the time, and we're constantly trying to make new cool stuff that speaks to you. So come talk to us, come follow us. I'm going to do a little here's where you can follow us command, and thank you so much for your time. All right.
See everybody.
Hope to see you again soon.